Great. Hello, everyone. Well, it's very nice to be with you this evening. My name's John, as Matt introduced me. I work as a professor at the University of Southampton. I'm based in the medical school there, where I'm a research professor, so I don't do too much teaching. I do a little bit now and again, but my main focus is on running a research group in the field of regenerative medicine. Regenerative medicine is the science of trying to explore how you can stimulate stem cells. I work principally focused on stimulating stem cells within the body, with our own bodies, to repair. So maybe you're familiar with the salamander, which is a small reptile that's able to regrow its limbs when they get cut off. That's our dream. That's what we're trying to work towards, maybe one day being able to regrow bits of our body when it stops working. I'm married to Nay. We live in Southampton. I've got two little girls, Anya and Agnes, and I'm a member of Southampton Lighthouse International Church, just round the corner from here. So tonight we're going to be thinking about this question of whether you have to choose between science and faith. And it's, I think, quite a deeply held suspicion and belief today that there is a kind of, basically a fundamental conflict between the way of scientific thinking and the way of religious thinking. I was watching a program, a Netflix series called Young Sheldon. It's a spin-off from the Big Bang Theory. Some of you may have seen it. And there's a great scene in one of the early episodes where this young Sheldon, who is a kind of precocious young scientist, you'll know who Sheldon represents in the series, a very direct, outspoken science geek, basically. And he's young Sheldon, and he's in church. He's brought along by his mum. And the sermon's just started, and straight away his hand's up in the service, and he's asked a question, and then his hand shoots up again, and the Christian minister who's preaching is at a complete loss with what to do, and is ultimately, this young Sheldon makes complete mincemeat of him. And Sheldon's parting shot is, let me just see if I can get these slides to work. How's this going to... there you are. There he is. This is a parting shot as the conversation finishes. Science is facts. Religion is faith. I prefer facts. Very straightforward. And I think many of us will know exactly what he's talking about. As a scientist, I cringe a little bit at the simplistic take on science as fact. But what he's saying is that science is an approach to knowing stuff based on observation and experiment and evidence and logical deductions and trying to come up with physical mechanisms as a way of understanding the world. And surely that's at complete odds with any kind of religious faith. This is a very eminent scientist, James Watson, who with his colleague Francis Crick discovered the double helical structure of DNA. And this was in Richard Dawkins' God Delusion interview with him. He says, occasionally I meet them, he's talking about religious scientists, and I'm a bit embarrassed because I cannot believe anyone who accepts truth by revelation. Now, obviously, that hurts my feelings a little bit. But it also touches a nerve. Because I think to myself, well, what if I am living a kind of double life? And I have kind of accepted some kind of intellectual compromise. I accept one kind of evidence in my professional life as a scientist, and I have a completely different standard in my personal life as a Christian. And maybe you're here today as someone who's interested in the claims of Christianity, and yet you're worried that you might have to kind of come up with some intellectual compromise in order to accept them. If it really is a choice between sure facts and blind faith, I know which way I'd go. If that's the case, you need to stop right there and get out of here. Okay, don't leave just yet. Well, there's more to say. Okay, so one of the things that really, really encouraged me early on in my faith and in my development of science as a scientist was discovering that actually littered all the way through the history of science are people of faith. James Watson was also known as starting the project, the great project called the Human Genome Project, this attempt to map the entirety of the human genome. His successor was a man called Francis Collins. And 2006, same year as the God Delusion, Richard Dawkins' God Delusion, was released, he wrote a book called The Language of God. And in it, he told the story of the Human Genome Project. He told the story of his own development as a scientist, but he also told the story of how he became a Christian. And towards the end of the book, he said this. He said, I had started this journey of intellectual exploration to confirm my atheism that now lay in ruins as I was forced to admit the plausibility of the God hypothesis. So if nothing else, that should give us pause. That it's not quite as simple as people like James Watson might have us believe. It's quite possible to be someone immersed in a scientific way of thinking and yet find oneself intellectually compelled towards faith in the Christian God. And this isn't just one, this is many, many people throughout the history of science. Maybe if you've dabbled in the popular science literature, you'll be familiar with the kind of old story of how the great scientists of the past had to kind of fight a battle against religious types to do away with superstition and bring in an age of rationality and science. But if you spend any time reading about the actual scientists who did the work, the great revolutionaries, you'll realize that that is an absolute caricature. That actually, throughout the history of science, people like Galileo and Kepler and Newton and Faraday, and you could go on and on and on, were people who didn't just happen to believe in God, but were fundamentally motivated by their belief in God to do science. The history of the Nobel Prize, the last 100 years, they reckon about 60% of Nobel Prize winners would profess as being Christian. The Nobel Prize Hall of Fame would give James Watson plenty of cause for embarrassment. This has led one historian of science, Peter Harrison, to say, those who argue for the incompatibility of science and religion will draw little comfort from history. The myth of a perennial conflict between science and religion is one to which no historian of science would subscribe. But that's history. Science is, of course, about progress. Maybe as science has developed, the idea of God has slowly been made more and more redundant as the gaps in our knowledge have been filled. This is certainly the view of this chap here. This is, let's go back again. Oh dear, I wonder if I can go back. Would you mind flicking back for me? Thank you. This is his take on it. He says, science, the system of belief. This is, Peter Atkins, a former professor of chemistry at Oxford. Science, the system of belief founded securely on publicly shared, reproducible knowledge, emerged from religion. But as science discarded its chrysalis to become its present butterfly, it took over the heath. For Peter Atkins, religion had a role to play in our kind of intellectual development as human beings, but that role has now been thoroughly superseded by the progress of science. He goes on to say, there is no reason to suppose that science cannot deal with every aspect of existence. Only the religious hope there is a dark corner of the physical universe or of the universe of experience that science can never hope to illuminate. So here we see two very big ideas, and it's these two ideas that I want us to explore tonight as we think about this question of whether science and faith are incompatible. First, there is a very strong claim here to the sufficiency of science. For Peter Atkins, Science is able to address and answer all of the questions that we might wish to ask as a human being, and is able to give this complete, fully orbed picture of the universe that leaves no space for religion. The sufficiency of science. But also, there is a claim to the exclusivity of science. Only science gives us reliable knowledge of the world. Science gives us this publicly shared, reproducible knowledge. So for Peter Atkins, science is the only light we have and the only light we need in order to understand the world. There's no denying the great power of science. Let me give you a bit of a insight into one of the big breakthroughs in my field. This guy here is a guy called Shinya Yamanaka. He is a Japanese researcher from Kyoto University. And this is probably one of his most famous papers in the last 20 years. And he discovered something called induced pluripotent stem cells. What on earth are they? So what a stem cell is basically the very first type of cell we were as an embryo. Stem cells are cells that have the potential to become all of the different types of cells that make up our body. Pluripotent refers to this ability to specialize into our bone cells and our brain cells and our blood cells. And now, over the course of development, this potential is quite quickly lost as cells specialize and become committed to the different cell types that make us up. Which means that when we injure ourselves, our capacity to repair is quite limited. These cells can only regrow a certain number of times, and they're committed to a certain cell type, so they can't repair our tissues, and often we have scar tissue forming. Shinya Yamanaka found this amazing thing, that it was possible to turn on certain genes in a fully developed adult cell, like a skin cell, and reprogram that cell back into a stem cell again. So it recovered the potential that your cells had right at the beginning of their development. It's a remarkable discovery. It means that one day scientists might be able to take some of your skin cells from the inside of your cheek, grow them up in the lab, and then use them to create new neurons to treat your Parkinson's or new pancreatic cells to treat your diabetes. It's a very, very amazing discovery, and it surprised the world at the time. But how did he demonstrate whether that was true or not? Well, he did a very important experiment. He took some of his stem cells that were growing in the lab that he turned on, he'd induced into pluripotent stem cells, and he injected them back into a 3-day mouse embryo. That's that circle on the left, and the cells you can see in that little tube going into the embryo. Now, if they were just normal skin cells, they would die and not do anything, and the embryo would probably die as well. But if they were stem cells, his idea was that they would contribute to the development of that mouse. And that's indeed what he saw. This mouse here is a chimera. It's a mouse that's half made up of the original mouse cells in an embryo and half made up from those cells that were a few weeks earlier growing in a lab, in a flask in Yamanaka's lab. It's a very, very powerful demonstration of an astonishing discovery. And it's exactly this that gives science such credibility in our world. Richard Dawkins says, science boosts its claim to truth by its spectacular ability to make matter and energy jump through hoops on command and to predict what will happen and when. And this power, the power of science to predict what will happen and when, to change our world, has meant that lots of people have said, well, you know what? Science is the only really reliable way we have of knowing anything. And so if we're to understand the universe, if we're to understand ourselves and our place in it, the only reliable tool we have is science. And so we should limit our explanations of things only to what we can find out using the scientific method. It's a very developed research program. This is Daniel Dennett talking about his working methodology. He's a philosopher, but his working methodology in trying to explain the mystery of consciousness. He very humbly entitled his book, Consciousness Explained. That was back in 1991, I think. I think there's still some explaining to do. But anyway, he said, there is only one sort of stuff, namely matter, the physical stuff of physics, chemistry, and physiology. We can, in principle, we're not there yet, but scientists are working on it, account for every mental phenomenon using the same physical principles, laws, and raw materials. For Dennett and others, all we need to understand everything is physics, chemistry, and physiology. Now that might seem sensible, to limit ourselves to only those reliable methods we can really say are reliable. But the first thing that I want us to see is it can lead to some really problematic results. This is an interview with Richard Dawkins on the topic of love. This was actually an interview with Nick Pollard, who some of you may know. Nick Pollard asked Richard Dawkins, when you think about your wife, what does love mean? Dawkins says, well, we've been into that before. It's an emotion, which is a manifestation of brain stuff. He was then asked, Jesus said love is the purpose of life. Does that sound nonsense to you? Dawkins said, it sounds like something grafted on, a superfluous excrescence on life, which I feel I understand better. But it doesn't surprise me that brains, being what they are, have a capacity to invent spurious purposes of the universe. So, for Richard Dawkins, love is nothing more than a manifestation of brain stuff. And any idea we might have that love has a deeper significance than that, any idea that our love for those we care about might somehow give our lives meaning and significance, that's something we're grafting on. It's something we're imposing on reality. It's a story we tell ourselves, but it's not really real. Now, I think for most of us, that would seem inadequate. Of course, love is something that has effects in our brain, but surely we would want to say something more about it than that. It's a very stark perspective on life, but it's necessitated by this prior commitment that people like Dawkins have to explaining stuff only in terms of physiology, chemistry, and physics. Now, that's a fairly soft argument against this approach. This argument that it doesn't really feel like right. It feels like there should be more we can say about love than simply that it's a manifestation of brain stuff. But there's also a harder philosophical problem with what Richard Dawkins is saying here. And that comes out in the very last thing he says when he says, it doesn't surprise me that brains, being what they are, have a capacity to invent spurious purposes of the universe. He's talking about our brains, what they are for. Another philosopher of science, again, very committed to explaining everything in terms of biology, chemistry, and physics. This is Patricia Churchland. She says this about our brains. Boiled down to essentials, the principal chore of nervous systems is to get the body parts where they should be in order that the organism may survive. A fancier style of representing, by which I think she means our ability to think and try and make sense of the world, is advantageous so long as it is geared to the organism's way of life and enhances the organism's chances of survival. So, for Churchland, the reason we have brains, the reason we think, the reason we try and make sense of the world is not actually to discover what is true. That's not what the world's about. That's not what our brains are for. Our brains are survival machines, and that is all. Now, sometimes it helps us survive to know true things about the world. I need to know that that lion over there wants to eat me. But that's not necessarily so. A good example would be religion. In Churchland's view, religion certainly doesn't have any truth benefit. Its benefit should be understood purely in terms of survival. The reason religious belief is so widespread, almost universal among human beings, is because it's a youthful myth that aids our survival. Maybe it helps social cohesion or something like that. It's got nothing to do with truth. But you see the problem, don't you? It's not just religious beliefs that are knocked out in that way. Any sense-making belief is knocked out. I can't trust what my brain tells me because my brain isn't there in my head to give me truth about the world. My brain's there just to help me survive. I can't trust my brain to access truth any more than I can trust my heartbeat to keep track of time. That's just not what it's for. Now, the problem with that, of course, is it's a belief that undermines itself. Oh, now, wait a minute. I'm sorry, I've lost my... Here we are. Thank you. So another philosopher scientist who recognizes this guy called Raymond Tallis, he, not a believer, but he sees this problem. He says this biologistic image, this kind of attempt to explain ourselves only in terms of biology of humans, effectively denies the centrality, even the possibility of precisely those unique capacities that have made humans able to theorize about evolution or to develop neuroscience. If, he's talking about Darwin's Origin of the Species, really were the last word on humanity, all there is to say, then it could not have been written. He's saying this reduction of our brains, of the way we think down only in terms of biology, ends up undermining science itself. This attempt to kind of censor out anything in our human story that is not validated by a science experiment ends up making our human story incoherent. We can't understand love. We can't even understand science itself. So in order to make sense of the world, in order to make sense of ourselves, it seems we have to go beyond science. But what is there beyond science? That's the whole problem, isn't it? We've talked about how science may not be sufficient, but what other options do we have? If only science is reliable as a way of finding stuff out of the world, what else have we got to go to? Bertrand Russell put it very starkly. He says, whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific methods, and what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. Now, again, there's a problem with this, because Bertrand Russell is clearly claiming to know something here, and yet he's not a scientist. He's a philosopher. He didn't come to this conclusion through scientific methods. He came to this conclusion sitting in his armchair, smoking his pipe. He's saying, in other words, that we don't really need to listen to him, and who am I to disagree with the great Bertrand Russell? But there's another, perhaps more fundamental problem here. This is a quote from a slightly boring philosophy of science textbook, which I'll explain in a minute. He says, if he is a man engaged in any important inquiry, he must have a method. This is apparently a mistake that only men make. And he will be under a strong and constant temptation to suppose the universe ultimately of such a sort that his method must be appropriate and successful. E.A. Burt here is describing this mistake behind Bertrand Russell's mistake. The mistake of trying to make your method determine what reality is, rather than allowing reality to determine your method. Now, that sounds very confusing and abstract and philosophical, so let me put some flesh on the bones. It's actually a very, very basic mistake. It's a mistake that my daughter, this is Anya when she was only maybe 9 months old, very cute picture. But by about this age, she'd already started to learn not to make this mistake. When she was maybe 9 months, I could be playing with my phone in front of her, like a good father, and she'd obviously want to play with my phone. If at that point, at that age, I could just put my phone in my pocket, and it would be like the phone no longer existed. She would just move on from the idea and want something else she couldn't have. But a few months later, that no longer worked, because she learned something very important about the universe. Just because she couldn't see something didn't mean it wasn't available for her to play with. She just needed to use a different method. So she would tug on my sleeve and put on a cute face like that, and sure enough, sooner or later, she would gain access to my phone. That method, by the way, has stood the test of time. And scientists learn this very early on as well. It's no good saying, I've got this really, really great technique. It always gives me reliable results, so I'm going to limit my understanding of my subject area only to what I can find out using this method. An astronomer doesn't say, well, my telescope can only see so far, so I'm going to squeeze my understanding of the galaxy into only what I can see through my telescope. No, scientists know they need to go and find new ways of seeing further. Scientists are always asking a really important question, the question, what if? What if we could just see further? What if we could see deeper? What if it worked like this? What if this was how this all worked? And that doesn't just motivate research, it also helps us decide our methods. What if it was like this? How would we find it out? What experiment would we define in order to discover this? It's a very important question. It's what keeps science moving beyond its current limits. So as we finish, I want us to start asking some what-if questions. What if there is a purpose to the universe? What if that purpose was love, like Jesus says? What if the purpose of our brains and our heads wasn't just to help us to survive, but to help us discover what's true and real and to make sense of things? What if there was such a thing as purpose? How do we go about discovering it? It's a chap called Leslie Newbigin, and he made this very, very helpful point. Cause can be discovered by science, but purpose cannot, because until the purpose has been realized, it is hidden in the mind of the one whose purpose it is. Newbigin recognizes that purpose is something that persons have. Persons who can look forward into the future and form desires and take plans to achieve those desires. Purpose is something persons have. And as such, it's hidden. It's hidden in the mind of the one whose purpose it is until it is realized. He gives an example of a building site. He says, imagine you're walking along and you discover in a clearing in some woods a trench in the ground and maybe some bricks stacked up here and there. And you decide there's a purpose to what's going on. I think it's a good image because that's kind of how we find life, isn't it? There's lots of mess and chaos and unfinished business. But there are also all kinds of hints of purpose. The sense that our lives are meaningful, that they matter. The sense that there is a good and bad, a better way of doing things and a worse way of doing things. A sense of order and beauty. There's all kinds of hints of purpose. But how do we discover what that purpose is? And Newbigin says you've got two options. You can take the kind of empirical, experimental approach, and you can go back every day and see what happens, see what emerges from this building site. You can wait, in other words, until that purpose is realized and find out what that purpose was. Or the other approach is to go and talk to the builder or the architect and ask them what the purpose is. And Newbigin says, when it comes to discovering the purpose of our lives or the purpose of this universe, waiting around until the end is not an option. If we're to discover what the purpose is, the one whose purpose it is needs to make it known to us. At the heart of Christianity is the claim that God, the one whose purpose it is, has made not just his purposes, but his very self known and knowable to us. In the beginning of one of the accounts of Jesus' life, in the Gospel of John, we just read it before the service, at the beginning of the service, it says this, very famous words, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him." That word, is the Greek term logos. It's this ancient Greek idea that the philosophers had that behind everything, underlying everything, there was this kind of rationality, this sense-making principle that would make sense of life, that would help you learn how to live the good life. This word logos. And John does something very interesting. He personalizes it. This word, logos, he was in the beginning with God. But there's more. He goes on and he says, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. At the heart of Christianity is that God, the one whose purpose it is, the Logos behind the universe, has entered into our world, has become flesh, has made himself accessible to us. The reason, ultimately, I think that science is so successful, so powerful, is not principally because of the ingenuity of scientists, though often they're very ingenious. It's not principally due to the rigors of its processes and its checks and balances, although they're also very important. Ultimately, the reason science is successful is because of the accessibility of its subject matter. Science deals with the stuff you can get your hands on, the stuff you can prod and poke and manipulate and control. And when science advances, it's often because new techniques, new ways of seeing have emerged that allow us to get on our hands on whole new areas of reality. Allows us again to see things further and poke and prod them. It's the accessibility of science that underlies its great success. John is here claiming that we can know God for exactly the same reason. God has made himself accessible to us. Two things as we finish. First, he's made himself accessible to our scrutiny. You can't scrutinize a lofty philosophy or a private revelation in a cave. But this claim that God has entered into history, became a man, impacted history, changed lives in history, this is a claim you can investigate. Like a cosmologist looking at the kind of redshifts of radiation to explore the impact of the Big Bang millennia ago. Or a paleontologist studying the impact of an asteroid and studying how it's changed the current layout of the land and the species. Or maybe a geneticist uncovering our evolutionary history through the impact of some change to our genetic structures. So we can explore and investigate the impact of the life of this man, Jesus of Nazareth, on history. 3 years of ministry, 3 years interacting with people, and resulting in his death on a cross. And yet here we are, 2,000 miles away, 2,000 years later, still talking about him. Remarkable claim, and that is something you can investigate, and the writers of the New Testament invite us to do just that. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life. The gospel writers wrote their accounts so we could hear their testimony and investigate their claims for ourselves. But this is more than just investigating a historical claim. If ultimate reality is not something, but someone, then the way we are encountering that reality will change. The claim of Christianity that the word, the reason behind everything, is a person. A person, no less, who knows you and loves you and has gone to very great lengths to make himself available to you. Now, if you're a scientist like me, that might make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. We scientists, we're not people. We prefer to dissect the subjects of our investigation rather than talk to them. But you see, if ultimate reality is not something but someone, then that will change the way you approach them. When I met my wife, she said to me, "Hello, my name's Nay." If at that moment I said, "Look, I'm sorry. I'm a scientist. I can't accept truth by revelation. I'm going to need to see a recent utility bill, please, to prove your name. I know for a fact she probably wouldn't be my wife now. That would have shut down the conversation. My method would have determined my rather sad reality. If ultimate reality is not something but someone, then the way we need to explore that reality will change. It will mean opening ourselves up to the possibility that God is there, that he actually wants you to know him. So as well as investigating the claims, scrutinizing it, going to the Gospels, looking at what they say, looking at the evidence as well, an appropriate method to this claim would also be, I think, to pray, to open yourself up to this personal reality, honestly, saying, I don't know if you're there, but if you are there, help me understand, help me to see. This would be a way of honestly engaging with this relational reality behind the universe. If we say, I'll only believe in stuff I can do an experiment on, I'll only believe in the stuff I can prod and poke and manipulate and control. Do you see? That's deciding your answer even before you've begun your investigation. It's not ultimately very scientific. Let me wrap up. My hope for this evening is really to open up investigations once again that may have stalled because of a fear of going beyond the scientific method. Science is wonderful and powerful, but it is neither sufficient nor exclusive. To say that science is the only type of answer we're going to give ends up distorting reality, especially reality in which personhood and purpose and beauty and love play such an important role in our experience. To say I'll only believe in stuff I can do a scientific experiment on is to end up shutting down investigations, foreclosing your answers. I believe the claim that there is a logos, the God behind the universe, and that he has made himself available to us is a hypothesis worthy of our investigation. My experience is not only that my questions are answered, but that whole new areas of life and questions open up. If it's true, reality is much more interesting, not less. Thank you very much for listening.